Well, the editing for the Donington video is going well. Let's see if there's been any news recently. Well, So whilst I was editing my Donington Park video, go check it out on the top right if you haven't watched it already, and also a few days before Lando Norris took his first ever win at Miami, news broke after weeks of speculation that well-renowned chief designer and arguably the greatest ever designer Adrian Newey would be leaving Red Bull in the first quarter of next year after nearly 20 years of working at the Milton Keynes outfit. The 65-year-old will be taking mandatory gardening leave before being allowed to join another team in March 2025 if he still wants to work in F1. However, despite this, he will still be allowed to continue work on the RB17 track day car that was announced to be in development in the middle of last year. Given I made a video a couple of months ago reacting to the news of Lewis Hamilton joining Ferrari in 2025, along with my reaction to Andretti's entry being rejected, I thought it would make sense to make a video reacting to this news, as even though I usually tend to avoid doing back-to-back videos on the same motorsport series, this was one I couldn't sweep under the rug. Plus, I was already in the process of editing the Donington video, so I really couldn't avoid the clash. So with that being said, here is my reaction to Adrian Newey's departure, along with what this might mean for Red Bull going forward. But first, a backstory before we get to my reaction. At the end of 2005, Adrian Newey, after joining McLaren in 1997, would leave the team after 8 years, following a fruitful relationship with then McLaren team principal Ron Dennis, which at one point nearly saw Adrian move to Jaguar in 2001, only for the move to be blocked. And on the topic of the Milton Keynes based team, that would end up being Adrian's next destination, as in November of that same year, it was announced that Adrian would be joining Red Bull from February 2006 after outbidding McLaren to have his services. Whilst he wouldn't have any influence on the 2006 car, given the car had already been designed and built before Adrian arrived at Red Bull, he would be there to oversee the team's first ever podium at Monaco, courtesy of David Coulthard. 2007 would be the first Red Bull that would be designed by Adrian Newey, and there were clear differences with the design of the 2007 car compared to its two predecessors. Whilst the team would suffer from reliability issues throughout 2007, which ironically would also be their first year with Renault engines, performance-wise the team made a big step forward, with them grabbing their second ever podium at the Nürburgring, courtesy of Mark Webber, which allowed them to achieve their target of finishing 5th in the Constructors, 2 places better than the previous 2 years, albeit due to McLaren's disqualification from the Constructors that year as a result of being found guilty of espionage on Ferrari, which would end up being dubbed Spygate. The 2008 car would follow a similar design principle to 2007, and whilst the team initially got off to a good start, with Coulthard getting them another podium at Montreal, which initially saw them being in the hunt for 4th in the Constructors with both Renault and Toyota, the team would end up slipping back in the second half of the season, picking up only 5 more points compared to the 24 they got in the first half of the season, finishing once again down in 7th in the Constructors, even finishing behind their sister team Toro Rosso, who ironically were able to get their first ever win at Monza, courtesy of Sebastian Vettel. Vettel would end up joining Red Bull in 2009 as a result of David Coulthard retiring from F1 at the end of 2008, and it would come at a perfect time for Vettel, as 2009 would see a major change in the regulations. The cars in question would look drastically different, with the front wing being made wider, along with the rear wing being made narrower and higher. On top of this, a lot of the aerodynamics would be cleaned up, and it would also see the return of slick tyres after over a decade of F1 using groove tyres. The new regulations presented an opportunity for teams to make strides in the pecking order, and guess which one of those teams would take full advantage? The Adrian Newey designed RB5 would end up taking a huge step forward compared to 2008 and would be the start of Red Bull becoming serious front-running contenders in Formula 1, with the team taking their first ever win, courtesy of Sebastian Vettel, in the rain-affected Chinese Grand Prix. From that point on, they would win 5 more races, 3 of which coming from Vettel, whilst the other 2 came from Mark Webber, who finally grabbed his first ever win at the Nürburgring. Despite this though, they wouldn't win the title, as thanks to the dominance of Brawn GP in the first half of the season, Red Bull would just miss out on the title, but would finish a career best second in the Constructors, whilst Vettel beat Barrichello to the runners-up spot in the standings after winning the finale at Abu Dhabi. After finishing the 2009 season with the fastest car on the grid, the aim for 2010 was clear: go one better than 2009 and win both championships. 2010 would see the banning of refueling, which would see the pit stops be much quicker. For that season, Red Bull launched the RB6, which featured a revolutionary design at the rear of the car known as the blown diffuser, which was featured heavily in F1 back in the 80s and 90s, only to be reintroduced by Adrian Newey as part of the design of the RB6. The amount of downforce the blown diffuser was producing gave Red Bull a huge advantage on the rest of the field, especially around high-speed corners, which in turn allowed Red Bull to grab pole in 16 of the 19 races that were contested in 2010. Despite this, however, they would have a hard time during the races, as out of the 16 races they took pole in, they were only able to convert 9 of them into the win, 5 of which came from Vettel, whilst the other 4 came from Webber. The races they didn't convert were either down to reliability issues, a lack of race pace on some occasions, and at times the drivers running into each other, like at Istanbul when the pair were fending off the 2 McLarens of Hamilton and Button. Despite these teething troubles, the pair would end up being in a title fight with the Ferrari of Fernando Alonso come the finale at Abu Dhabi. And after both Alonso and Webber made early stops after the safety car, which saw the pair of them get stuck behind the Renault of Vitaly Petrov, Vettel, after dominating in front, would come through to take his 5th win of the season. And with both Alonso and Webber finishing 7th and 8th respectively, Vettel, after not leading the championship at any stage of his F1 career up until this point, would become the 2010 Formula 1 World Champion. After only 5 years at the team, Adrian had transformed the team from being stuck in the midfield to winning both championships, with Red Bull also winning their first ever Constructors title at the previous race in Brazil. From that point on, it would be a run of dominance, as in the 3 years that came after, Red Bull once again won both World Championships, dominating both the 2011 and 2013 championships with Sebastian Vettel, whilst also winning the 2012 title with the German after a close fight with the Ferrari of Fernando Alonso that went right to the final race at Brazil and saw Vettel put in an amazing drive in changeable conditions after being involved in a first lap collision with the Williams of Bruno Senna. It seemed that the Vettel-Newey-Red Bull combination would be unstoppable in the years to come. However, 2013 would turn out to be the last title for Sebastian Vettel, as a huge change for 2014 would see the Red Bull dominance come to an end. The 2014 season would see a huge regulation change, which not only would see the cars look drastically different compared to 2013, but it would also see a new engine formula, with the 2.4 litre V8 being replaced by a 1.6 litre V6 turbocharged hybrid. This change in engine formula would end up being the thing that would prevent Red Bull from winning 5 world titles in a row, as whilst the Adrian Newey designed RB10 continued to have the best aerodynamic car, the Renault engine that was powering their car was holding the team back, as a lack of straight line speed compared to the Mercedes powered teams, combined with some reliability issues as well, saw the team fall way behind the Mercedes Works team. Although the team would only drop to second in the Constructors, they were near 300 points behind newly crowned champions Mercedes come the end of the season, with Daniel Ricciardo, who replaced the retired Mark Webber, being best of the rest outside of the Mercedes pair, with him picking up 3 wins that year. As for Sebastian Vettel, he would have a nightmare 2014, as for the first time since 2007, he would fail to pick up a win all season. With the lack of straight line speed from the Renault engine holding the team back, it led to Vettel, who originally had a contract with Red Bull until the end of 2015, to leave the team a year early, activating the release clause in his contract, which stated that if he wasn't in the top 3 in the Drivers' Championship by around the Italian Grand Prix, he was free to leave the team. Vettel would end up joining Ferrari for 2015 after Alonso activated his release clause from Ferrari 2 years early, whilst Red Bull replaced Vettel with Daniel Kvyat, promoting him from Toro Rosso. The backwards turn in performance almost led to Adrian Newey leaving the team as well, but he was persuaded to stay on despite receiving an offer from Ferrari. 2015 would end up being worse than 2014, as not only was the Renault engine still worse compared to Mercedes, but it was also now worse compared to Ferrari, who had made a big leap forward compared to 2014. This, as a result, saw the team fail to pick up a win all year, recording their first winless season since 2008. It wasn't a good look in the championship either, as from finishing second in 2014, the team ended up slipping to 4th in 2015, even being beaten by the Mercedes-powered Williams team, whilst both Kvyat and Ricciardo finished 7th and 8th respectively in the Drivers' Championship. Furious at this drop of pace, the team were considering splitting up with Renault at the end of 2015, with the team even publicly lambasting the French manufacturer over the lack of straight-line speed. However, after being unable to strike a deal with either Mercedes or Ferrari, with Ferrari only offering a year-old engine to them, and not being interested in Honda due to their tricky return to the championship with McLaren, Red Bull ended up staying up with Renault for 2016, rebadging the engines as Tag Heuer thanks to their new sponsorship deal with the Swiss watchmaker, due to their relationship with Renault being fractured, and the fact that Renault were focusing on their return to F1 as a full works team after repurchasing the Lotus team in the middle of 2015. 2016 would see a huge improvement for Red Bull, as even though the season got off to a slow start, the team were able to leap ahead of Ferrari in the pecking order from Spain onwards, and were also able to end their winning drought, with Verstappen, who replaced the demoted Kvyat from Spain onwards following Kvyat's first lap shenanigans at Sochi, taking his first ever win in his first ever race with Red Bull, whilst Ricciardo grabbed his first win since 2014 at Malaysia, assuming the lead from Hamilton after his engine blew up. This in turn saw Red Bull beat Ferrari to second in the Constructors, with Ricciardo becoming best of the rest again outside of Mercedes, finishing third in the standings, whilst Verstappen finished 5th ahead of Raikkonen. This in turn led to Red Bull signing a 2-year extension with Renault, once again badging the engines as Tag Heuer. Despite this though, this would only lead to 2 more years of frustration, as despite a change in the regulations, which put more emphasis on the aerodynamics, and also still getting a few wins between those 2 years, the team were held back further by the Renault engine, as along with a lack of straight line speed compared to the Mercedes and Ferrari engines, reliability would also hold the team back, with even Ricciardo and Verstappen getting frustrated by the lack of reliability. With the relationship with Renault continuing to fracture, Red Bull were once again looking for a way out, and thankfully this time they were able to find a way out. Towards the end of 2017, sister team Toro Rosso had signed a deal with Honda after the Japanese manufacturer's relationship with McLaren fell apart, along with their deal with Sauber collapsing as a result of Manisha Kaltenborn leaving her role as team principal. Throughout 2018, the Honda engine in the back of the Toro Rosso showed a lot of potential, and it was because of this that Red Bull saw an opportunity. And so, in June 2019, specifically a few days before the French Grand Prix at Paul Ricard, it was announced that Red Bull would be switching to Honda engines from 2019, finally splitting away from Renault. The switch to Honda engines saw the team's straight line speed improve massively, and it finally meant that Adrian Newey could now make his ideas work to perfection now that the team had a very fast engine in the back. The team were now able to fight with Ferrari in 2019, with Verstappen picking up 3 wins that year at Austria, Hockenheim and Interlagos. Despite this, however, they were unable to beat Ferrari to second in the Constructors, as whilst Verstappen was extracting the best out of the car, his teammate on the other hand wasn't, as Pierre Gasly struggled to get to grips with the RB15, which resulted in him being demoted back to Toro Rosso after the summer break and being replaced by Alexander Albon, who performed much better in the car but too late to overhaul Ferrari. 2020 would see Red Bull become the closest challengers to Mercedes as a result of Ferrari going backwards, with Verstappen being able to upset the Mercedes on some occasions, picking up 2 wins that year. However, they once again had the same issue with the second driver, as like with Gasly in 2019, Albon struggled to adapt to the RB16 and found himself most of the time fighting in the midfield. This led to Albon being demoted to reserve driver for 2021, with his seat being taken by Sergio Perez. There was a lot of optimism for Red Bull in 2021, as after a strong end to 2020, the hope was that they could challenge Mercedes for the title. And thanks to a slight regulation change which saw some of the floor of the cars being trimmed, it played into the hands of Red Bull, as the slight tweak benefited cars that were at a higher rate towards the rear, which was what the Red Bull RB16B was set up to have, compared to Mercedes, which was set up at a lower rate. This, as a result, saw a close fight all year between Verstappen and Hamilton, with Perez and Bottas playing rear gunner for their respective teammates. And in the end, after a controversial final 2 races, Verstappen would walk away with his first ever world title, giving Red Bull their first world title since 2013 and Honda's first since 1991. And from that point on, Red Bull would go on another period of dominance, as despite a major regulation change and also Honda distancing themselves from F1, with Red Bull obtaining the IP for the Honda engines, Red Bull would still emerge on top, dominating both the 2022 and 2023 World Championships, with 2023 being the most notable, with them breaking McLaren's record for the most dominant car in percentage terms, winning 21 of the 22 races held that year. 2 of which coming from Sergio Perez, and the other 19 coming from the now 3-time world champion, Max Verstappen. 2024 looks to be another dominant year for Red Bull, with Verstappen winning 4 of the first 6 races. However, before the season began, turmoil behind the scenes started to surface, as due to serious allegations that were being made towards Red Bull's team principal Christian Horner, it led to rumours that key personnel could end up leaving Red Bull as a result. And as you might imagine, one of these key figures happened to be Adrian Newey. And so, on the 1st of May of this year, it was announced that Adrian Newey would be leaving Red Bull in the first quarter of 2025, taking mandatory gardening leave from the conclusion of the Miami Grand Prix to March of next year. And so, that's that. After nearly 2 decades, with 7 drivers' titles and 6 constructors' titles, with potentially a couple more to come, Adrian Newey's time at Red Bull is officially over. So why has he left? Will he continue in F1? And if so, what team will he join? Well, there are 3 reasons why Adrian has decided to leave Red Bull, I believe. One reason, of course, is the alleged turmoil that is going on currently at Red Bull. Whilst I won't go into details about the allegations surrounding Christian Horner, it's safe to say that the way Red Bull handled the whole situation was extremely poor. The fact that he was still allowed to continue working as normal whilst Red Bull were investigating the serious allegations just doesn't sit right with me, and I'm pretty sure a lot of people share the same view. Red Bull, in my opinion, should have done the more logical thing, which was to suspend Christian for a period of time until the investigation had fully concluded, as it was clearly becoming too much of a distraction for everyone else working at Red Bull. But as we know, for whatever reason, they chose not to do that, and it has led to this alleged turmoil that's been going on behind the scenes, not just with Adrian Newey, but also other key members as well, such as Helmut Marko, who himself is no stranger to controversy, and of course Max Verstappen, who I will touch on in a little bit. Even Adrian Newey himself, in an interview with Martin Brundle this past weekend at Miami, said that with everything going on this year, he felt that it was the perfect time to move on. Although he never said word for word what he was talking about when he said that, it was very clear from what he was referring to. But aside from the alleged turmoil, there are 2 other reasons why he's called it a day at Red Bull. One being that he needs a break. Newey has been working in F1 since the late 80s, working at the Leighton House March team, where during his time at that team, he was able to get the team to put in some great performances. He has been in F1 now for nearly 5 decades, and at 65 years old, and with the calendar getting larger and busier, now's the perfect time for him to step back and enjoy life a bit more without having to stress about F1. Whether this leads to him retiring altogether remains to be seen. But the third reason being, and this is only speculation on my part, is that Newey is looking for a new challenge. With a new engine formula coming in for 2026, along with the cars becoming slimmer, one could argue that Newey is looking to be a part of a project that could make leaps and bounds when the new regulations hit. In terms of where that would be though, I will get back to in a minute, but that would all depend on whether Newey wants to stay in F1 or not. During his interview with Martin Brundle, he says he hasn't got a plan yet for when his gardening leave with Red Bull expires, suggesting that his future might not be in F1. For a long time, Adrian Newey has had a fascination with boats, particularly with the America's Cup, even at one point collaborating with Ben Ainsley. There could be a possibility that he could leave motorsport behind to focus solely on his other passion and try and become successful in that. Another option, as alluded to earlier, is him possibly retiring, given he's worked in F1 for nearly 5 decades across 4 different teams, and the fact that, as he alluded to in his interview with Martin Brundle, he needs a break. Whether that's a short break or a permanent break remains to be seen. Personally, whilst I wouldn't be surprised if he takes up one of those 2 previous options I mentioned, I still believe he will work in F1 after his gardening leave expires, as I feel with the regulation change coming into effect in 2026, and being a guy who is known for loving a regulation change, it'll be just too tempting for Adrian to get his drawing board out. But if he does stay in F1, where will he go? For me, there are 2 teams that I believe he could go to. One of them, of course, being Ferrari, who, as Adrian has admitted in an interview with David Coulthard and Eddie Jordan on the Formula for Success podcast, came close to joining Ferrari on 3 occasions, 2 of which in F1, and the other occasion being in IndyCar, specifically back in 1986 when Ferrari tried to enter the Indy 500, which ended up failing to materialise. Given that Lewis Hamilton will be joining the team in 2025, the idea of Adrian Newey designing a car to try and get Lewis a record 8th world title before he retires could be very tempting for the well-respected designer. The only issue being with him joining Ferrari though, is whether the idea of him moving to Italy at this stage of his career is a wise decision or not. Only time will tell, I guess. The second option, in my opinion, is a return to Williams. Recently, reports have surfaced that James Vowles has recently been in talks with Adrian about a return to Williams. Now, the idea of Adrian returning to Williams might sound a bit odd, given where Williams currently are in the pecking order. But, as mentioned earlier, Adrian could be looking for a new challenge, and the idea of him potentially turning Williams' misfortunes around and bringing them back to the glory days in the long term could be that challenge that Adrian is looking for. And given Mercedes seem to allow their customer teams to beat them, hence why McLaren and Aston have been allowed to challenge them this year, could make the idea of Adrian joining Williams not that strange. There was at one point talk that he could join Aston Martin, given the fact that they'll be going into a partnership with Honda in 2026, an engine that Adrian is currently familiar with, and the fact that Adrian was the brains behind the Aston Martin Valkyrie hypercar that'll be making its WEC debut next year, back when Aston Martin was sponsoring Red Bull. However, given recent reports that have come out recently, it looks highly unlikely that will happen. But given I said that about Kalle Rovanperä doing a part-time schedule this year in WRC, who knows at this point. With Adrian leaving the team at the beginning of next year, the question on everyone's mind will be, how will this affect Red Bull going forward? Personally, I don't see it having an effect on the team this year, as all the upgrade plans for the 2024 car would have already been decided and planned before Adrian announced his departure. 2025 and 2026, on the other hand, could be a very different story. For the beginning of next year, I don't see his departure affecting things too much, as Adrian at this point would have more than likely have already designed the 2025 car, and I'm pretty sure the team would have already have started building the 2025 car at this point. However, as the season goes on, I can see their rivals catching up, as given Red Bull won't have the influence of Adrian Newey when it comes to upgrading the car over the course of 2025, I can see that having a massive effect on them, and I wouldn't be surprised if that transfers over into 2026 when the new engine formula arrives, and also when Ford becomes the new engine supplier for Red Bull. 2026, in my opinion, could see Red Bull being on the back foot as a result of Adrian's departure, and there is already existing proof of this happening in F1. At the end of 1996, Adrian Newey left Williams to join McLaren for 1997. Williams came off the back of dominating the 1996 season with both Damon Hill and Jacques Villeneuve, and went into 1997 in the hopes of winning the title again, this time with Jacques Villeneuve and Heinz-Harald Frentzen after Hill was cruelly let go. Although Adrian left Williams before the start of 1997, he had already designed the 1997 car and oversaw the car getting built, so much so that the team were able to get off to a strong start, winning 3 of the first 4 races, 2 of which coming from Villeneuve, whilst the other one at Imola came from Frentzen. However, as the season progressed, the absence of Adrian Newey started to have an effect on the team, as throughout the course of the season, Ferrari were able to close the gap and would end up challenging Williams for the title that year, with Michael Schumacher even leading the championship for some parts of the season, even going into the finale at Jerez. Thankfully for Williams, they were able to retain both titles from 1996. However, come 1998, which saw a huge regulation change to the chassis and the tyres, Williams ended up being on the back foot, falling way behind both Ferrari and McLaren, who ironically were the ones employing Adrian Newey. 1997 as a result would turn out to be the last time Williams won the World Championship, and it was ironically with the last Adrian Newey designed Williams. Whether the same will happen to Red Bull for both 2025 and 2026 remains to be seen, but don't be surprised if it ends up being that outcome. And what of course does that mean for Max Verstappen, as along with Adrian Newey, he was also one of the key figures rumoured to be disgruntled about the whole controversy. Whilst there have been rumours that Max could join Mercedes in 2025, 3 years before his contract with Red Bull is set to expire, given that like with Vettel back in 2014, he has a release clause in his contract, I don't personally see that happening, given that Red Bull are still the dominant force in F1 right now. However, if Adrian's departure from Red Bull does end up having an impact on Red Bull's performance in the future, it would not surprise me if Max started to consider his options outside of Red Bull. Anyways, those are my thoughts on Adrian's departure. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below and whether you believe this will have an impact on Red Bull going forward. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next week for another video.